Welcome to our webinar series for professionals.
Welcome everyone to this, the first webinar in 2023. All very exciting. I'm Anne-Catherine, co-founder of Nordic Laboratories and DNA Life. And we are a group of companies that is dedicated to functional medicine and personalized lifestyle. And today we have very much in focus genes and information from your genes and how to manage disease, chronic symptoms, etc. So that's all very exciting. And with that, I'm just going to share my screen just for a little, because today...
So hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them.
I have to mute you when I talk then. That sounded like Star Wars. Anyway, today's webinar is a bit of a teaser, because in March, the 10th to the 12th of March, 2023, we have a in-person certification course where Umao is the educator. And for those of you who haven't experienced Umao before, we decided to do this an invite for this webinar so you can see his skills. And just if I will take this link and put it in the notes, because then you can just click onto it and see prices and get PDFs. There's some more information about it that you can read at your own time or own leisure. But yeah, so it's a teaser, but you will find out why we want to show you how Umao educates, because he has a bit of he has a different way of educating. It's very, very nice way of educating. And and Umao, Umao and I, we've known each other for a long time. I was just looking at your bio, Umao, and it said that you've been working with functional medicine and educating, and you've been writing many, many books and seeing patients for many years. And it was like for over 20 years, but now 2023, I think we can say 25 years soon.
It's getting there.
Yeah, and we have known each other, since the beginning, Umao, and
since the early 2000s, I think.
Yeah.
2003, some way back, decades ago.
And what is quite amazing with Umao and his educational skills is also that he is he understands biochemistry at a very, very high level. But he manages to educate and explain the biochemistry at a level that can make everyone really understand it. Sometimes, and don't take this too close, sometimes you can get a little bit intimidated by his knowledge, and you can lean back and you can think, I'm never going to learn this. But Umao will support you, and we will support you. I could see that Oliver Moore is on the group here today as well. He's one of the support people in Nordic and DNA Life. So we are a group here who wants to help you, support you, even when you feel, I can't do it. So that's kind of like an invite for you to reach out and continue educating yourself. If you can't make it in London on the 10th to the 12th of March, we also offer the online education courses. They are not with Umao. Well, I think some of the introduction may be with Umao, but it's with our South African team. So, it's some people actually do Umao a couple of times and do online sometimes, really to get a brush up on it as well. But I will stop talking, because it's really Umao we want to hear. And so I will just stop sharing my screen so that you can, take on the stage.
So now you better hold on to your hats and mittens and gloves and everything else, because what I do, which apart from knowing biochemistry and functional medicine quite well, I will literally draw our way through. So you're going to be subjected to about 55 minutes of interplay between genes, genetics, biochemistry, functional medicine testing, what that means in a clinical perspective. And so I'll draw it live. So I thought that we'll just look at 2, maybe 3 genes if we have time for that today, and start connecting the dots. So I want to give you an idea as to why doing genetic testing and testing these genetic variations makes sense, not as the be all and end all, but to get way better understanding of your clients, what they will respond to, what they won't respond to, or if they respond in a matter very different from what you expected, because sometimes you might have clients where you say, but we've done everything by the book, from a normal biochemistry, functional medicine point of view, but they're still not responding, whether it's their symptoms or their biomarkers and so forth. And that might be due to genetics. So I think that, when we look at genes, we can look at these SNPs, that are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So they're these little spelling variations or mistakes in your genetic code. And that, by the way, when it comes to the DNA live tests, we're not really looking at mutations or deletions, but we're looking at these little changes. So it's kind of like one letter off in the instructions for an enzyme or a molecule, and thus that changes things a little bit, but it won't mess up things completely, right? So, and some of these SNPs, they just cause these little changes. So, imagine if you were to speak to someone and say, lovely hat, except you misspell or mispronounce it. So you replace the H with an F. And so you're like, lovely fat. Now, someone, if you were at the Ascot or the Royal Derby, wherever, and you walk up to a beautiful lady and you say, oh, lovely fat, she might, be a bit offended. It's like, excuse me, did you just call me fat but lovely? Or what's going on here? And oh no, sorry, I just mispronounced. So, I said, I meant hat. I just mispronounced or misspelled it. So these SNPs, right, they cause these little changes in the structure of molecules and enzymes, and that obviously is going to change how they work in the body. It's not going to completely disrupt them and make them not work, but it will change them, either make them work a bit better, a bit worse, or just a bit off key. But sometimes these little changes or variations then lead to either predictively, you can figure out what would be better to do or not to do for your clients, or if you start intervening and then things kind of don't respond the way you expect them to, it might be because there's something going on. So, these days, obviously, one of the things that's still very much in vogue from a nutritional point of view is to look at people who go keto, low carb, LCHF, all these diets, right, where they'll drop carbs and they're going to increase fats. And the general notion is, when would you want to do a keto and LCHF? Obviously, if you have a glucose problem, but also often we would say, well, if people have high lipids. So imagine they have high cholesterol levels, total or LDL, or also triglycerides. And for quite a number of patients or clients, actually dropping their glucose and their carbs will help bring down their lipids, especially triglycerides that are elevated, and cholesterol, or at least lead to a better distribution of cholesterol particles when you look at the difference between total, LDL, HDL, and so forth. But have you ever had clients where if you do that, actually what happens is that their lipids go up? Their lipids become worse, even though they might have now be normal glycemic. So you've normalized their glucose that might have been elevated by exchanging carbs with fats. And somehow they still, their triglycerides, their cholesterol levels and so forth, either don't change or they actually worsen. Now, why would that be? Because normally we say, well, what usually drives triglycerides will be carbs. But that's not the whole story. Now, there are also some gene variations that actually get you in a bit of trouble, or where you have to be way more careful if you're going to look at any of these diets with more fat, even healthy fats. So we have what's called apolipoprotein E. That's abbreviated ApoE. And we have different variants. And remember, with genes, we always have two copies, one from either parent. So for ApoE, we're going to have two copies. Now, normally, what we'll have is a variation called ApoE3. So that's the normal from both parents would be a double ApoE3. However, with Apo, you could also be an ApoE2 on ApoE4. So either of those just changes that molecule just a wee bit, not very much, but a tiny bit. And that's going to change its function. And then, of course, you're probably wondering, well, what's the function of apolipoprotein E? What does it do? Well, first of all, it has an impact on lipid release. So when you want to control the amount of VLDL particles and triglycerides that are released by the liver, part of what's necessary to control that, to make sure you don't get hyperexcretion, is going to be ApoE. So when you have the normal version, ApoE3, then, if you look at what's in the bloodstream in terms of lipids, if you have ApoE3, your ability to control what's released from the liver is normal. But if you have an ApoE4, or even worse, if you have two copies, you kind of lose control. So you're going to have a liver that does this constant, not feedback, but feed-forward cycle. So it just keeps on dumping VLDL particles and triglycerides. So that, in the first place, predisposes you for hypertriglyceridemia and also elevated LDL particles, right? And that's not enough, because then also, right, so your liver plays a central role. I mean, it releases all these lipids, VLDL particles that contain triglycerides. Now, leftover used VLDL particles actually cycle back to the liver and are used for making LDL particles. So in the first place, if you're ApoE4, that means that you're sort of second rate or second stage pushing LDL secretion as well, because you tend to have too much VLDL, and VLDL, once it's kind of been metabolized or used, becomes LDL. On top of that, then you have that ApoE, when it's the ApoE3, is actually supposed to protect your cholesterol particles. So let's say we have an LDL particle circulating in the bloodstream. If it has an ApoE3 on it, then it's going to be more stable and better protected. So it's less likely to become rancid, right? And when is it that cholesterol and cholesterol particles actually become atherogenic? It's not cholesterol on its own, it's not LDL particles, but once the cholesterol inside oxidizes and becomes oxy-LDL, then you have an issue. But the challenge again is, so if you have an ApoE4, right, so you have this slight gene variation, then your LDL particles in the bloodstream are less protected, so they're way more likely to go rancid, right? And once they go rancid or they're oxidized and you get oxy-LDL, that's what really drives atherosclerosis aggressively. On top of that, your liver is supposed to reabsorb LDL particles to take them back in. Now, part of what affects that is also ApoE, the apolipoprotein E. So if you have an ApoE4, it also disrupts hepatic reuptake of LDL particles, right? So now you can see just that one genetic variation means that you're going to get 4 problems stacking up in terms of controlling lipids. Because once you get one, or especially if you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you're going to have elevated VLDL, elevated triglycerides, you're going to have elevated LDL particles. You're also going to have longer LDL circulation. So whenever these LDL particles that now have been released in excess, they also stay longer before they're cleared. And then you have lowered LDL protection. So your LDL particles are more likely to become rancid, and that's when they become detrimental and damaging. And on top of that, what's the true purpose of LDL particles? What are they supposed to do? right? Normally what they're supposed to do is obviously deliver both cholesterol to tissues, also to actually deliver fats, healthy fats. So we can say like good fats. Not the nasty ones. And also fat-soluble nutrients. So things like carotenoids and fat-soluble polyphenols. And that's actually impacted as well. So when you have, so once you get ApoE4, then your LDL handover of the goods, so to speak, is also decreased. So that option, you can see how that's just one genetic change. It's just one misspelling. It's one single amino acid that changes in the apolipoprotein. It's not going to render it completely dysfunctional. However, it is going to render it functioning slightly off. But unfortunately for ApoE4, you get at least 6 knock-on effects that stack up. And then you get all the effects here, because if you have increased LDL particles, lower protection, circulation, that also leads to more atherosclerosis. And that then, just knocks on. So when you have people who have who have one or more copies of ApoE4, they kind of become super hypersensitive to all the things we already know. And so if you had someone who happened to have an ApoE4, 1 or 2 copies, putting them on an LCHF diet would not mix very well. So LCHF plus ApoE4 is pretty bad news. From a molecular level, you're going to have something along these lines. And, so I've seen cases of people who, when did the LCHF, it got their glucose levels right in place. They lost weight, so all those things got better, and their mood and their energy levels became better. Unfortunately, their lipids just went all over the place. They went sky high and became detrimental. So on one hand, actually, if you have people who have problems with lipids and also have problems with diabetes, pre-diabetes, you might actually want to check them for ApoE4 before you go LCHF, because even though you might drop their glucose levels, you could still have untoward effects. And usually also we'd say, what's the problem? If you look at fats and lipids, what's the normal connection? So the normal interaction between fats and lipids is, okay, excess saturated fats, not saturated fats per se, but an excess of those, or rancid fats, so fats that have become rancid, basically oxidized, things that have been in the deep fryer, overcooked things, highly processed fats and so forth, right? We know they definitely will push triglycerides, and they also tend to push up total and LDL and VLDL cholesterol. Whereas we'd say, all the good fats, so omega-3s, monounsaturated fats and so forth, right? They should all be beneficial when it comes to controlling lipid levels, except that's not really the case if you're ApoE4. So we know for ApoE4, an excess even of good fats tends to drive triglycerides and cholesterol particles up, or at least the less beneficial and more detrimental types of cholesterol particles. In fact, you have studies showing that for ApoE4, if you do high-dose EPA and DHA, so high-dose fish oil, that's another way to bring down elevated triglycerides. Feed people, have them eat lots of fish, but also have them intake, eat a lot of fish oil of high quality, of course, except if you're ApoE4, it's not going to lower your triglycerides, it's actually going to raise them further, right? And And so that also, the other way around, when you see these interactions is, well, if you have someone who has 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4, that tells you that you better be ahead of the curve. So I'd suggest you do a lipid profile every year. For people who are 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4, even if they're an ApoE3, which is the normal one, because here ApoE4 is going to kind of overrule or knock out or, trump, and trump these days might be a loaded word, at least for some people. So it's trumps E3, but not in a good way, but in a bad way, because if you have an ApoE4, 2 copies, then very minute changes in diet can still quickly lead to massive changes in lipids and lipid control. So, I mean, I have one client who, we tested, had 1 copy of ApoE4, and he had perfect lipids, and then he changed workplace, and he worked at some very nice, prestigious companies. So, they had really good food. And so, and he had free access to lots of vegetables and fish and free range and organic poultry and so forth. But there was one difference. In the first place of work, they would use extra virgin olive oil to saute vegetables in the oven. And if they were to saute vegetables, pan fry them. If they were to fry fish, they used extra virgin olive oil. But in the new place where he went to, they would use like grapeseed oil, still extra virgin olive oil for the salad dressings and the marinades and so forth. But just for some of the frying, they thought, well, the extra virgin olive oil, it's going to be affected anyhow, so we'll just leave that alone. And that little change. So 1 meal a day, he still had the same lunch, or same breakfast, the same dinner, but just 1 change in the fat source, and not even like he had margarine or anything with trans fats, but just these tiny amounts. That was enough, because he had an ApoE4, to skew his lipids and started pushing his triglycerides and his total and LDL and VLDL cholesterol up. Whereas normally, say, that small change wouldn't mean a thing, right? So, and this is just as an example to illustrate that there's something going on. Now, the other thing is that ApoE4 also has, we know there's a link with Alzheimer's and ApoE4. So ApoE4 does increase the risk of early onset Alzheimer's. And we don't have all the details as to why it does that yet. But one thing is, since LDL particles and also VLDL particles are actually supposed to deliver fat, right? One of the things they do is deliver fat to tissues. That also means they help carry EPA and DHA. But when you have an ApoE4, the ability of LDL and VLDL particles to hand over fats to tissues is decreased. So you get this issue that there's actually, even if you have EPA and DHA in adequate amounts in systemic circulation, that's not to say you have the same transfer to cerebral circulation to the brain, right? So what we also see now is that people who have ApoE4, 1 or 2 copies, even if they're actually getting plenty of EPA and DHA, or if we were to do a fatty acid profile with whole blood or red blood cell levels, then of course you can't do a live brain biopsy on a living human being. That's not, well, I mean, you could do if you were to do open brain surgery, but otherwise no. But we know from, do autopsies or for animal studies that there's going to be a mismatch. So, so one of the issues here is that, yeah, that's not going to go through. Now then we say, well, couldn't we just increase EPA and DHA massively? Because that should then sort of try to push through or overcome the less efficient transfer. The problem, of course, is if you're ApoE4, well, if you eat large amounts of EPA and DHA that tends to actually give you high triglycerides, right? So, but there's a workaround. So what we can do is, it turns out that if we start getting EPA and DHA in phospholipid form, rather than as triglycerides, that has a way more efficient transfer across the blood-brain barrier, even when there's this impairment due to ApoE4 interfering with the ability of VLDL and LDL particles to hand over and deliver healthy fats, right? So thus there is some way to bypass that without either having to then feed people's EPA and DHA to the point that their triglycerides become elevated, because then we just like we have a problem here. Now we solve that, but we move it elsewhere. So normally, right, you'd say, well, for EPA and DHA, get some high quality fish oil, but usually fish oil is going to be triglyceride form. But if you look at krill, right, the EPA and DHA in krill is phospholipid form, or also if you actually get eggs in the yolk, that's also phospholipid. Then you can all of a sudden, we know at least from animal models, you get way more efficient transfer of omega-3 fatty acids into the central nervous system, despite having this kind of genetically, not complete impairment, but derangement, lowering function and capacity, right? And then now that also, because we know there's some link between Alzheimer's and inflammation, right? But maybe no wonder, because if we have cerebral levels of EPA and DHA that tend to be lower unless you do something specifically to sort those or bypass that genetic vulnerability or bottleneck, well, then any sort of insult that causes inflammation in the brain is now going to cause way more inflammation, because you don't have enough EPA and DHA to downregulate inflammation. But we can partially bypass that, you know, and of course we could spend way more time talking about ApoE4, but I'll just give you a few more bits. We can also look at another gene and how that starts interacting with all sorts of things, and that has clinical applications either from preventive, taking preventive steps or screening, or also managing if people aren't responding as normal. And then there was just a quick question. What about, there's a Danish company that's called Norfolk, and they also have a oil from a small, I think it's actually from a plankton that has EPA and EHDA, but that's a ether lipid form from Norfolk, for those of you who are tuning in from Denmark or know in Sweden. And in theory, ether lipids also, when you have them packed as ether lipids, that also ought to give you better absorption and better transport, despite the slight defects caused by ApoE4. Now, another thing, what might you generally recommend an elderly client, if we can use that word? I'm 45, soon 46, so for some reason, I start cringing when I have to use the word elderly, because when will that, apply to me as well? But anyway, if you had an elderly client with a bit of hypertension and maybe also slightly high lipids, I mean, one lifestyle hack that seems to be quite well supported is that one or that half serving of alcohol per day. That should help bring down blood pressure. It should help change their lipids, at least make their LDL particles bigger, fluffier, more stable. Sure. But not if you have ApoE4. So once you then do that, then, again, that wouldn't be beneficial. So in fact, for myself, I have one copy of ApoE4. I'm an ApoE3, E4. And you can see from my skin color, I'm a Danish citizen, but the slight brown coloration is due to my father. He's from Barbados. So I thought, speaking of genetics, well, you know, I'm half Bajan. So I probably should have a small glass of Bajan or Caribbean rum every evening, or at least most evenings of the week. And it also turns out I'm actually distantly related to the people who owned Mount Gay, the Bajan, you know, producer of really high quality rum. Except because I'm an ApoE4. If I were to do that, and I tested that, my lipids, when I just had like a serving or half a serving of alcohol per day, and that was enough to push my lipids in another direction. My other challenge is that I have to take really high doses of fish oil, because one of the things that got me into functional medicine and biochemistry and so forth is that at the age of 18, I developed Crohn's colitis. I've developed multiple sclerosis, reactive arthritis, autoimmune hepatitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia, and lost 40 kilograms of body weight. So I have an inflammatory issue. So that's why I take really high doses of fish oil, but I also have an ApoE4. So for me to sustain being able to get about 20 grams of EPA and DHA preformed per day, then I have to start doing a lot of these things that lower lipids, not statins, but, you know, I have to take high doses of niacin, anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams per day. And for that means I didn't have to look at my liver, because niacin can be hard on the liver. So to make sure my liver enzymes don't go up, I also have to take silymarin and some NAC, right? So again, as you can see how all these things, they kind of interconnect. So you have one gene with a slight spelling mistake that changes the structure of a molecule or an enzyme or a protein slightly, that then changes bodily function, not massively, but just maybe a little bit. But then that little bit has a, you know, like an echo or ripple effect. And then you put that into the matrix of, well, here this person does something else for lifestyle purposes, or, you know, that's supposed to be beneficial, but that then backfires, or where they respond very differently from expected, or they get untoward side effects. So, and I know, because I thought, you know, when I took lots of fish oil, well, there's no way I could have high triglycerides, but I measured, and I did, until I started doing niacin and quite a few other things. So that's one example. And of course, at the course, we're not just going to look at ApoE4 and lipids and cardiovascular disease, but, you know, but that's what I'm going to delve into, some of these interactions and how things connect. And also an interesting thing is when you start looking at genes, you might have gene variants, you know, if you have slight spelling mistakes, or even the normal variants, that whether they're beneficial, neutral, or detrimental actually depends on the setting. So another thing to illustrate is, you've probably heard of this enzyme, catechol O-methyl transferase, COMT. So COMT, its function is to take a methyl group from S-adenosyl methionine and stick it onto some sort of catechol. Oh, and hey, Kane and Oscar, I see you as well. I'll get to answer all the messages. I'm just trying to keep on lecturing in the same thing, so I can see my good old friend from Birmingham is on. And we can't drink beer now, Kane. I'm sorry. So anything that has a catechol group, you use COMT to stick a methyl group on to kind of neutralize that catechol. And now that then means that there are at least two areas where this becomes highly relevant in terms of increasing either vulnerability or actually making people more resilient. So COMT, we know that from the people who have, you know, who are wild types, that means they have two normal copies to the ones who are homozygotes. So they have two misspellings. They have a misspelling in both, right? When you go here, that's going to leave you with maybe 20 15% of COMT function. So all of a sudden, your ability to take methyl groups and stick them onto catechol groups in different molecules is only 1/5 or less. And that then becomes highly relevant in terms of certain areas of neurotransmitter metabolism. So in neurotransmitters, we have the whole group called catechol amines, or catecholamines, depending on how you want to pronounce it. We have dopamine, noradrenaline or norepinephrine, depending on what you want to go with. And we also have adrenaline, which isn't actually a neurotransmitter, but it's a full-blown hormone. And since they're all catechol amines, one of the pathways for breaking down dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline is actually through COMT. There are other pathways as well, but that's one of the ways, so we can stick a methyl group onto them and thereby neutralize them. So they're taken out of play. So now if you have someone who has So you have someone, so COMT helps regulate levels of these. So imagine you have someone with a super high COMT functioning. So they're wild types. They have full-blown COMT functioning. What that means is that they're more likely to have lower levels of dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. Now, whether that's beneficial or detrimental then becomes dependent on the environment, because if you put people in a nice, safe environment where there's no trauma, there's no danger, there's not excessive stress or anything like that, actually tending to be on the lower end of dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline is going to make you a bit less motivated, a bit more, I'm just going to be nice and chill, and not as much, someone who will go do things, get things done, advance, progress, and so forth. So in some ways, you can see people who are wild type for COMT in a nice, safe environment. If you look at, they're less likely to make major changes in their social status and so forth. So here, detrimental is maybe not the right word, but there's definitely a difference also you see in personality and drive and motivation also, because dopamine is really important, not just for learning, but for motivation. Now, on the other hand, if you then place these people in a high stress environment, or if you subject them to some sort of trauma, right, which will especially push noradrenaline and adrenaline, but might actually also push dopamine levels, then all of a sudden being people who have high COMT function, it becomes detrimental, because here you have an environment where, if we were to say, these are the levels of catecholamines, and that's the normal range, you're going to start pushing levels up. And if you then break down catecholamines faster and more efficiently, you're less likely to go over the top into this sort of territory where all of these neurotransmitters and hormones become detrimental, because they kind of leave your body and your brain in a perpetual stress or stage of overdrive and overactivity, right? On the other hand, if you're homozygote for COMT, so you have low function, then if you're in a nice, peaceful environment, you're likely to have higher, but not excessive levels of dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline. So that's going to get you a bit more wired, but in a nice way. It's going to make you more of a go-getter and so forth. But the moment you then take the people who are low functioning, so they're the homozygotes, they have 2 spelling mistakes, right? So they have a spelling mistake in either copy of the gene. All of a sudden, that stress then pushes them into the territory of elevated dopamine, elevated noradrenaline, and elevated adrenaline, which for the short term will push their stress response, but also long term, if you have perpetually elevated noradrenaline and adrenaline, that's more likely to get you into a chronic stage of stress, get you into PTSD, trauma, and so forth. And we're also beginning to look at COMT and pain sensitivity, especially the risk of developing chronic pain, or to look at what extent stress changes pain perception and pain processing. So imagine you have someone who has some sort of painful condition, osteoarthritis, they had some sort of bodily damage from a car accident, whatever. That's going to push pain mediation. That in itself will push stress, and then put them on some sort of high external stress load on top of that, from family, from finances, from work, just being, the situation the world's in these days, whatever. And all of a sudden, they're way more likely to transition into chronic pain, and this, where pain is now perpetuated and generated and sort of held onto at the central nervous system level, because they can't get their levels of dopamine, noradrenaline down, right? And also with dopamine, dopamine is good to have elevated to a certain extent, but are any of you aware of the potential dark side of dopamine or of excess dopamine? What could go wrong if you have high dopamine? What sort of problems might you actually get? Anxiety, well, yeah, it could, to some extent, anxiety, I mean, you normally think noradrenaline and adrenaline have an effect, but the thing is, dopamine also has an impact on the limbic system. So we tend to think of the effects of dopamine cortex, right, where in the frontal cortex and so forth, more dopamine is going to make you more motivated, focused, you're going to have impulse control and so forth, right? So that's good. But in the limbic system, dopamine actually can push negative or sort of affective sensations, emotions, and effects. That's also why a lot of the antipsychotics that are used for schizophrenia, mania, and so forth, they actually block dopamine in the limbic system and therefore help with some of the symptoms you might have from schizophrenia or psychosis. But at the same time, because they also block cortical dopamine functioning, people also say, well, yeah, sure, some of my mania, like if they hear voices, see things, all these illusions, whether they're visual or auditory or smell or touch, right, or strange notions and impulses, they go away. But at the same time, it's like, but I'm also left totally kind of this like chemically lobotomized, and I can't think, I can't do anything. And also often you get a knock-on effect that the production of sex hormones goes down as well. So, so excess dopamine can be an issue. And actually, if you have way too high dopamine in cortex, that can in some ways also lead to a problem, because it will make you hyper-focused, which is good. But in a social perspective, if you're super hyper-focused and you have a hard time attention switching, or you're just like, you're keyed in, then you might actually have a harder time if you're in an environment, whether that's socially or work-wise, where you have to be flexible, fluid, jump from one thought to the next, because you get kind of more settled in and almost a bit rigid. So, so I've seen a couple of cases of people who had a diagnosis of ADHD, but sort of atypical. And usually we'd say ADHD is about too little dopamine, right? Executive function, focus, impulse control, and so forth. But actually, their problem was elevated dopamine, which meant then in school and in learning situations, they weren't distracted. They were just really deep into something. So if they, in school, then Johnny or Alexandra at class, right, they've started thinking about something or looking at something. And over here's the teacher going, oh, we're going to solve maths, right? But they're thinking about biochemistry or dinosaurs or primates or environmental things or whatever. And so they're not really going to focus on what the teacher or the people externally want them to focus on, not because they can't get their act together or they're just kind of vegetating, but because there's something else going on. So the people who have low COMT functioning can also, one thing is that there's a potential issue with anxiety from high dopamine. And also, of course, if you have high noradrenaline, adrenaline, that's going to drive you being more anxious, unless you work hard and specifically to get that under control. But excess dopamine. And then again, how do these things then start playing together and interconnecting? Well, COMT obviously needs SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine, to provide the methyl groups. It needs to methylate all these catecholamines. Also, magnesium is a cofactor for COMT. So we know that people who have low magnesium, right, they tend to be more anxious because magnesium has a plethora of effects on neurological signaling, the sort of balance between neurological activation or slowing down, resting, and directly on the production of cortisol and so forth. But also, it also has an impact on your ability to break down all these catecholamines. So then imagine someone who's slightly magnesium deficient, or maybe not even deficient, but they're just not really well loaded or saturated with magnesium. And then they have low COMT functioning. Now, all of a sudden, that less than stellar intake and less than stellar levels of magnesium, whereas another person might just be, they don't sleep quite as well, or they are a bit, more restless and so forth. But here it pushes things really hard. So if you have low COMT functioning, you definitely want to make sure that you're ingesting plenty of magnesium, and you have to do it throughout the day. And of course, then, because COMT then puts you at a higher risk of getting to a level of stress that's kind of detrimental. Well, what happens when your stress levels and your stress signaling goes detrimental? Right? Well, you dump more magnesium in urine. So, then it kind of becomes a self-perpetuating issue, right? So often also I see people who have poor COMT functioning, they become way more sensitive to stress, and they become extremely sensitive to to low intake of magnesium, or they have to take way larger than normal levels to actually function normally or function optimally. And then what's something that we often ingest through food that could push the stress response? Or not through food, but through drink. What might be? Caffeine. So here again, you can see these things that start where things come together. So caffeine will push the production of noradrenaline and adrenaline. It can also push the production or the release of dopamine, but especially adrenaline, noradrenaline. If you then have a COMT issue, let's say you're both low on magnesium and you're genetically, wired, then all of a sudden the caffeine gives you a way exaggerated stress response. Even if you're a fast metabolizer, so genetically we have the gene called CYP1A2, which metabolizes caffeine. So even if you're quick to clear caffeine, you could still be super sensitive, not to the adenosine inhibiting effects of caffeine, but to the stress promoted by caffeine if your COMT is poor functioning. So, so again, you can see how a lot of these things, they start coming together. And then on top of that, what might inhibit COMT? What good things could we even say that we might think of using from diet, from supplements therapeutically, could inhibit COMT functioning? Quercetin, yeah, and in fact, a lot of the polyphenols, quercetin, some of the catechins in green tea, rutin, hesperidin, and so forth, right? so from green tea and so forth. So imagine now someone who has poor COMT functioning, who starts taking 500 milligrams of quercetin 2-3 times a day, either to treat some sort of atopic disease, asthma, eczema, hay fever, hives, to start managing histamine intolerance, or these days we know quercetin also has a beneficial effect on COVID, at least on, preventing going people from mild infection to severe disease. That would be brilliant, except if you're COMT homozygote, well, then you're going to suppress COMT function. Now, if you're already at only 20% functioning, and then you start taking super physiological levels of quercetin or green tea extract, that's going to dump function even more. So I know for myself, because I'm actually a COMT homozygote, and so there were certain periods over these last couple of years where I've been in environments where, okay, there were people who, there might be a risk of them having COVID, and I thought, okay, I want to decrease my risk of getting an infection or getting ill if I get an infection. So I actually, for a while, I took 500 milligrams of quercetin twice daily as a prophylactic. Except when I then started doing that, after a couple of days, I started feeling jittery. My energy levels they're at the high end of the scale under normal circumstances, but I was jittery like this. And then at night when I had to sleep, it was like, sleep. Well, I could also read up on these genetics or this biochemistry, or I could just go and do a small workout now. And then I thought, oh, what's going on here? It's actually the quercetin. So although it would be a good prophylactic or, to prevent severe COVID, for me, having low COMT functioning, that's not a good idea. And I also have a case of a client who had histamine intolerance, asthma, eczema, hay fever, and then had on their own read about quercetin and started taking a good dose, 500 milligrams, 2-3 times a day. And within a week, all these atopic symptoms and all these histamine-related symptoms started coming down. But then she started feeling anxious, jittery, and couldn't sleep. And so, and then we had gene testing, and turned out, well, she was a COMT homozygote. So she had poor functioning in the first place, now inhibit even further with some of these polyphenols that are highly beneficial in certain instances, but here actually cause more trouble for that patient. So then we had to find another way to deal with that. For her, we put her on diamine oxidase as a supplement, and we then supplement with really high doses of magnesium and vitamin C, because they can also have an effect as natural antihistamines and bring histamine levels down, right? So again, you can see how all these things, they interconnect, and starting doing some of this genetic profiling with DNA health, DNA estrogen, DNA pain, and so forth. What it will do is it will give you information about predispositions or areas of your patient's biochemistry and physiology or immunology and so forth that are super sensitive, that might actually, where you get the opposite reaction from what you'd expect when you do standard treatment, or areas where you have to say, okay, we have an issue here. Let's say it's a cardiovascular disease issue. But if we treat that by standards, unfortunately, because of genetic vulnerability, fragility, whatever you want to call it, then over here in some sort of other system, we could get untoward effects with the normal treatment. So we're either going to have to preventively treat here as well, or find an abnormal or a different solution. So from March 10th until March 12th in London, that's what we're going to spend the whole 3 days doing. And we're going to go through, we'll go to look at ApoE and COMT again. And there are more things with COMT as well, but that's far from all. We're going to go, look at all the ins and outs of DNA health, DNA estrogen, DNA pain, and then also look at some of the testing that goes with that, you know, because you're going to have to do other things. So also if you have someone who has COMT dysfunction, you might want to start looking at their neurotransmitter profiles and see what's going on with their dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline, and so forth, you know.
And actually, I'm just going to butt in here. Sorry. Because on Thursday, 4 o'clock Copenhagen time, we have a webinar on the neurotransmitter test. So for those of you who got a little bit excited here, you can already learn a little bit more on neurotransmitters on Thursday. And then, of course, join us in London and learn even more on the genetic side. Anyway, sorry.
And then, because we had a couple of questions. So from Kane, okay, so I measure SNPs and favor this test with other health markers, and then I do a cardiovascular profile with cholesterol, triglycerides, LDL, HDL, non-HDL, apolipoprotein A, B, lipoprotein little a, fibrinogen, hsCRP, lipoprotein, phospholipase A2, and homocysteine. So that's a pretty comprehensive test for cardiovascular, for lipids, and you know, and it will give you some really good detailed information on what's going on. So that's also, you know, if you want to be thorough, that would be along those lines, because you're going to get way more markers. And that, you know, when you look at lipids and cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis, most people think that it's just a matter of LDL or total and HDL levels, but no, there are way more things going on. The degree of oxidation, lipoprotein little a, kind of, I mean, the best way to describe the function of lipoprotein little a, it's a rather devious molecule. Think of it as a sort of magnet that kind of attracts LDL particles into the walls of your arteries. So obviously for atherosclerosis to happen, it's not that LDL particles settle on the outside, they have to penetrate and go through. And so then if you have LDL particles that have a lot of lipoprotein little a on them, it's kind of like it makes them go kamikaze on the walls of your arteries and dive bomb them like crazy and accumulate, you know. So that would definitely, and incidentally, there's also a big genetic impact on lipoprotein little a. So
what about particle size, Umar, for the LDL, if it's small, dense, and it's oxidized?
That's as well. So that's not, obviously, for this profile, that's not there. But the other thing to look at LDL particles is that when you think of LDL cholesterol, first of all, we're just saying how much cholesterol are we finding inside all the LDL particles. If we say these little blobs are cholesterol, we don't have an idea of the number of LDL particles or their state, right? So we could have one situation where we have one big LDL particle, so to speak, with all these cholesterols inside them, or we could have for smaller ones that probably have the same amount of cholesterol inside them in total. But so here you're going to get the same LDL cholesterol reading on a normal test. But this state over here is way more dangerous from a point of atherosclerosis. Whereas this one over here is definitely much better, because here it's what, you know, fewer particles just means the likelihood of them penetrating through the surface of the vascular endothelium is lower. Also, if they're bigger, it's kind of harder to squeeze something big through. And the bigger LDL particles are, the more stable they become, the more oxidation resistant they become. So measuring particle size and how much of cholesterol is oxidized, so measuring oxycholesterol, also tells you something. And again, that's one of the things, if you have ApoE4, even if your LDL levels are normal, because your ability to protect those LDL particles is impaired, then you have a higher risk of having oxycholesterol with normal LDL levels, right? And also ApoE4 predisposes for smaller, denser particles as well. So that's something to measure. You can partially get it by measuring ApoA against ApoB100. But that's still not going to give you the full number, but there's one ApoA on each HDL particle, and there's one ApoB100 on each LDL particle. So sometimes if you start looking at ApoA, ApoB levels, and then you also look at LDL levels, you can get an idea of whether the LDL particles are small or big. So if you have someone who has normal LDL cholesterol, as in the amount of cholesterol measured in all the LDL particles is in the normal range, but they have really high ApoB, then there must be a damn lot of LDL particles to contain that amount of LDL cholesterol. So you can actually sort of indirectly get an idea of particle size, even if you don't measure it directly. But again, sometimes the more thorough testing, the better. Except there's of course, the issue of cost and so forth. And then Roxana, you said, what about if you have really high LDL or HDL? Should that be tested? Well, yeah, really high HDL, you also want to look at, because really high HDL could suggest that there's something going on, again, especially if it's some of these very genetically driven hyperlipidemias. So that HDL levels will go up as well. And there are HDL subtypes. So actually, we're also starting to look at HDL cholesterol subtypes. There are at least 3 subtypes, and some of them might not be as protective as the others. So in some instances, you might have people who have, when you look at HDL cholesterol, again, remember when you're talking about cholesterol, it's not different types of cholesterol, it's the amount found inside this type of particle, but we don't know whether you have fewer, larger particles with that amount of cholesterol or more smaller. So there is some emerging research that when you start differentiating on HDL subtypes, that also has an impact. And so you could have people who have good HDL levels, but if they have the wrong distribution of the subtypes of HDL particles, they might not get the full protective effect of those HDL subtypes. So I think that took us through, just like as an example, how you can start interconnecting these things. And genetics tells you something that explains the functional testing you do, or the other way around. You have functional testing, it's off, or if you have people where you want to be ahead of the curve, especially if there's a family history, sometimes looking at the genetics will tell you way more about what's going on, but also what to do.
Exactly. I was just going to put up this one again, just with the link, if someone wants to go in and look at the link for the education. You're getting praised a lot for those who have also experienced you educating. This is now going to be 3 days where we are really going to in depth and with all the genes this way. You're going to get a little bit mind blown, but it's an amazing experience, and you're together with other practitioners, and yeah, it's a very nice social gathering as well. So we really hope to see you there. Umaru, as always, thank you for an excellent presentation. I think even in this hour, and even though it was just 2 snips, most of us still learn things every time you come on stage and educate us. I for sure know I do. There's always something new that you just can add. So with that, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for participating. I, of course, hope to see you all on Thursday, when we're going to talk more about neurotransmitters and measuring those in urine, and hopefully see you in London. And again, happy 2023 to all of you. Bye. Thank you, Mao.
Thank you.
If you do not already have an account with us, please contact our team and we will assist you. If you found this webinar helpful, please like and subscribe to our channel.